Chapter 3 ends on a note of excitement and suspense. Naomi correctly predicts that Boaz will not rest, but will settle the matter today. The first section of chapter 4, comprising verses 1 to 12, is devoted to the scene where Boaz assumes the role of kinsman redeemer. The process is recounted in careful detail, showing that everything was done properly, openly, and in front of the appropriate witnesses, who ratify and bless the transaction. The first kinsman redeemer, who goes unnamed, is initially eager to acquire the land, presumably thinking that he will keep it. But when Boaz tacks on the minor detail of marrying Ruth and producing heirs for her dead husband, he realizes that he is being asked to spend money, time, and some effort, but won't end up inheriting the land, and so he pulls out of the deal. This enigmatic figure is not completely nameless, however. The NRSV has Boaz say, "Come over, friend," but the JPS version has, "Come over and sit down here, so-and-so." It translates a Hebrew expression which can refer to people or places where there is no point in actually naming them. But its use here might be critical. That is, it might implicitly censure the man for not fulfilling his obligations. We remember from Deuteronomy 25 that if a man refuses to provide sons for his dead brother, the widow, in a public ceremony, removes one of his sandals and spits in his face. More famously, in Genesis 38, God killed Onan, one of Judah's sons, for not providing for his dead brother with Tamar. This is not exactly the same situation, but perhaps some of that feeling is hinted at. Some rabbis thought that because this man did not help the name of his kin endure, his own was erased from this record. Following this transaction, another blessing is given. Boaz blessed Ruth in chapter 2. Now the elders who are witnesses bless her again in verses 11 to 12. Boaz himself is also included in this blessing. But before we get to that, a deeper, hidden problem comes as close to the surface of the narrative here as it will ever do in this story. It is in Deuteronomy 23:3, Moabites are explicitly banned from joining Israel. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. This problem has, unsurprisingly, puzzled commentators and sages throughout the centuries. One solution was that it applied to male Moabites, not female. Thus, the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi thought that the real reason the first kinsman did not act as redeemer was because he had this statute from Deuteronomy in mind, but that he was wrong in his interpretation because it only applied to men. Returning to the narrative, we should note that Boaz specially titles Ruth as the Moabite in verse 10, as he publicly declares his acquisition of her as wife. Thus, if all the people and the elders accept this transaction, they accept this detail also. It is in all these careful and elaborate steps which Boaz has taken that we see this problematic law being dealt with, and so the entire community accept her. After this point, she is no longer called a Moabite. The blessing they pronounce is in the name of the Lord, and sure enough, it is the Lord in verse 13 who lets her conceive. Thus we can be sure that this whole process has the approval of God. The blessing itself is rich and full of significance. Ruth the foreigner, the Moabite, is placed alongside the matriarchs Rachel and Leah, the mothers of the 12 tribes, which is what is meant by them being described as those who built up the house of Israel. But it is not only a high status for Ruth, it also serves as a kind of Israelite genealogy for her, only one based on women. Rachel and Leah were also involved in a technical legal problem, even if retrospectively, because Leviticus 18:18 forbids a man marrying a woman and his sister simultaneously. Yet, as with Ruth, this was overcome with the blessing of their generations. The third part of the blessing invokes Perez, whose genealogy is recalled at the end of the book, leading down to David. Earlier I mentioned Genesis 38 with Tamar and Onan, where he fails to provide for her and so was destroyed. Tamar, through much intrigue, as you will recall, gains twin sons through her father-in-law, Judah. The first son pokes his hand out, and the midwife ties a crimson thread around it to mark him as firstborn. But he withdraws it, and the second-born, Perez, emerges fully first. The midwife exclaims in verse 29, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Thus he was named Perez, which means breach or break. The blessing then draws parallels between Ruth and Boaz and Tamar and Judah. Tamar is also a foreigner, but through highly unusual circumstances, illicit even, she secures her line. The name breach also suggests the breaking of something in order to produce life, which is appropriate in view of the Deuteronomic law. The story ends as it began, with Naomi. She is now the focus of happiness. Because of her, they bless the Lord, who has provided the son not for Ruth, but for Naomi. Ruth is not ignored, but is recognized rightly for the blessing she is as well, for her love has been better than 7 sons. These female neighbours also name the child, the only time in the Bible where this happens. The final genealogy makes clear the extent and rightness of the blessing, as it concludes with the name of David.